Thank you, Angela, and thank you so much for having me here today. It's wonderful to look out and see so many people I know too. And I wanted to start this with this image by Fra Angelico, who the images that I'm going to show at first are from San Marco in Florence, which I visited a couple of years ago. And it's a monastery, and he decorated well, I shouldn't say decorated. He painted on the monks' dormitory walls, their cells, images for them to meditate on. So a monk would be assigned to one of these cells. I don't know if it was for the entire time they were in the monastery or if they were moved around. And that whole idea of staying with an image for an extended period of time, living with it, and letting it sink into your very being is really interesting to me. So I wanted to start with Fra Angelico. And one of my dear friends gave me this prayer card a few years ago, which is a prayer to Fra Angelico. So I thought we would start with prayer and start with this prayer that's meant to be said to Fra Angelico, or to thinking about him and his role in the world. So, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. O light to the soul, disciple of beauty, God's true hand, you humbly revealed the form of virtue and palette of grace. Intimate of Christ, artist of his image, guide us to his holy face. Amen. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. So that little figure at the bottom is me taking a picture at the monastery, and this is one of my all-time favorite paintings. It's an Annunciation. Fra Angelico's paintings are, especially the frescoes like this, are emptied out. They're very simple. There's not much ornamentation. It's really about the encounter between the human and the divine, and that was something that has long stood out to me in his work. But I realized in going into this space the role these paintings played. So this is one of the monks' cells, and I love how the paintings echo the windows and the openings to the world. So they become this, for me, this kind of parallel between the world and this interior life. And the monks, I'm assuming they were cloistered, so they would see the world from this small window, but their reference on the world would always be their relationship to Christ. And this is the painting, a better image of it than I could have taken. And it's called Nola Me Tangere. So it's Christ after he's been resurrected, and Mary Magdalene goes to touch him, and she is told not to touch him. And that state, that passage and that liminal state between Christ on earth and Christ's resurrected body is really interesting to me, encountering that. And this is another image from the cloisters. This is not one of the monks' cells, but this would have been a chapel. And again, you can see that arch, that form that's repeated. I'm not sure if this was the arch at the bottom was a receptacle for holy water, or what that was. But then there's the image of Christ before he's crucified, his passion, and his birth, and the adoration of the Magi are depicted on the back wall. So I wanted to go to, this is a painting at Holy Family. You can visit it after church if you'd like. And I wanted to talk a little bit, just briefly, about my own first encounters with art, which were all through going to church. And I grew up in Pasadena. My family, much to the horror of the parish church that we were in at that time, St. Andrew's, hopped around from church to church. So the three churches that were my home when I was growing up were very different churches. There was Holy Family, St. Andrew's, which I'll show some images of, and then a church that burned down in, I think it was 1979, Our Lady of Guadalupe, which, if any of you remember that, it was on, was it California? Yeah, and Fair Oaks? Raymond. And that, they were such diverse experiences. So the primary population at Our Lady of Guadalupe was from Mexico. The services were mostly in Spanish. I didn't understand it all. The singing was amazing. Did anybody go to any of those services? Yes, and everybody's singing at full capacity and like a lot of it off key. It was amazing. I loved that environment. But when I was at Holy Family, this painting stood out to me, and it's the death of Saint Joseph. And there was a whole article written about it in the Tidings a few years ago. But I think my recollection of the history of the painting was that it was made without the soul of Joseph rising, and the pastor at that time felt that it didn't really accurately, like no one would know it was the death of Saint Joseph. And so the rising of his soul was placed in. And for me, there was something I had never seen a soul depicted before in my life. And the whole idea of how you depict that state was very interesting to me. And then this is, on the other hand, St. Andrew's, which is based on a European church, and was very intimidating. And you behaved when you were in that space, let me tell you. So the whole, here's the main image of God, which was this towering presence, and you felt under that mantle and that kind of watchful eye the whole time you were in that space. But the painting, the way that the imagery was depicted was really interesting to me. This is it kind of flattened out, the painting. So this is one of my early works, and I think my mom saved it because it was a Madonna and Child. And it was sewn, it was about this tall. But so just to show, I'll show more of my work later, but this is kind of an early kind of attempt to create something that spoke of my experiences with faith. And then I wanted to go to this image next, which is a painting by van der Weyden, a Renaissance painter. And it's a painting of St. Luke and the Madonna and Child. And I realized when I started putting this talk together that trying to think, my idea originally of what I thought was encountering the divine in pictorial space was kind of challenged by the idea of putting this together. What images would I choose out of so many that really spoke to that? And my own kind of predilection is an interest in imagery and the depiction of the human body. And I'm very interested in these complicated spaces that have been rendered in this particular imagery. So in thinking about it spatially and how it represents the divine, what's forefronted is the front of the painting is this depiction of St. Luke, who's drawing the Virgin and Child. And then there's the real world is brought in the background. So there are figures placed, they may be the donors of the painting, in that frame in the background. But what's forefronted is this experience in the painting. But it's very complex and layered, and there's a lot to look at and take in. But I'm especially interested in St. Luke because St. Luke was said to have painted the Virgin and known the Holy Family. And because that's been my life vocation, I have a special affinity for that. And I began thinking about spaces that have been really meaningful to me as well, not just within paintings, but this is Assisi. I went there for the first time 2 years ago, and I was really interested in St. Francis and St. Clare. And this was one site I never got to, but I have to go back now to see it, but it's the church that St. Francis originally restored, and that's been placed inside of another church, which I think is a beautiful kind of metaphor, too, for the soul. So this is a space I long to see and actually experience, too. So the next few images, I'm running through kind of the life of Christ and looking at certain paintings that I think that stand out to me when I think about encountering the divine in a pictorial space. And by pictorial, I mean the space of a picture, a represented image. But it can also, later on, I'll talk a little bit more about abstraction. And the one thing that I really thought about as I was putting this together is for every person in the room, what you would experience or what would speak to you in terms of the divine presence is going to be different. I think a lot about when I'm out looking at artwork, allowing myself to experience wherever I'm at in my life and whatever speaks to me when I'm in that space. And we're so fortunate to have so many good spaces to look at art here in Los Angeles that I'd really encourage you, if you're interested in painting and in art and in how it might address you and speak to you in terms of spirituality, to really just go look and see what speaks to you. Some things you won't have any kind of feeling or sensation in front of, and then others, at other times in my life, have spoken to me in ways that I had never considered before. So this early Annunciation is, I think, really, I think about a lot in terms of representations of the Annunciation because it's so real, with Mary really being kind of taken aback by the presence of the angel and this call to her in her life. This is a painting by Piero della Francesca, and I think it's the only painting I know of in art history of a pregnant Mary that is emphasized by the opening in her garment and then the pulling aside of the curtains by the angels to present her. And there's this sense in this space, it's a fresco in a church in Italy. There's this sense that the space, they're grounded, the angels are grounded, they have a physical being and presence. But what that space exactly is not clear. It might not be entirely of this world. It's kind of quilted almost, or a stone wall behind her. I'm also really, really drawn to the presence and absence of light in visual imagery. So this is a painting by de la Tour, a French painter, and it's the dream of Saint Joseph. He, in a lot of his work, used one single light source. So the candlelight exists between Joseph and the angel on the left side, but it's blocked by the arm of the angel. So it creates this kind of intimacy and kind of mystery between the two of them, and that space between them is very important. And his state of being asleep and unconscious is something that stands out too. This is a painting by a Dutch painter, and I'm mispronouncing this, but Gierkentot St. Jans, and the painting is about this big. I saw it, I came around a corner, I was in London at the National Gallery, and I knew this painting, I'd looked at it a lot, but I had no idea how tiny it was and powerful. It really packs a punch for a teeny tiny painting. But one of the things that stands out to me about this is how the light is used. So what we know as the most important kind of light source in our world, which would be like the sun and the sun, but then this flame, a fire that's on the hill, is the smallest point of light. And then the angel is larger, and then the Christ child illuminates everything in the foreground. And I love that that kind of turning over of the idea of what's the most important source of light in one's life. It's a very humble painting too. This is a painting by Andrei Rublev, a Russian painter, icon painter, and of the birth of Christ. And this space makes less kind of coherent sense. All of the main players are there. The Magi are coming in the upper left. But the gold forms this space that is considered a holy space. And Mary, the form that she's sleeping on, the cloth, is always, for me, stood out as such a strange form. The Christ child is wrapped in swaddling clothes, but more actually. And the swaddling cloths are like being laid in the tomb. And so there's this, in one painting, both the birth and the death foretold of Christ. I believe this is a painting by Hans Memling, and I love the intimacy of this painting, and it's all about just that embrace. So that space is very, very intimate, and their faces almost become one. This would be, you can see it's on wood, so and it's a small, those paneled paintings, a lot of them would have been quite small. And her hand is pressed up against the edge of the picture, so you feel like you're part of that space. You're brought into it and welcomed into the embrace. This is a painting that is by Rembrandt. That's also a smaller painting. It's in the permanent collection at LACMA, which is not up right now because they're doing construction. But if you get a chance to see this is, I think, an amazing painting. And I'm always struck again in looking at this at the response of this. I don't know if it feels almost like a child, but I'm assuming it's Martha or Mary. And that response to the raising of Lazarus. And then Christ's hand is also illuminated, but not as much as this very human response to a beloved coming back to life and that miracle. Another Rembrandt, The Prodigal Son, which has always been a favorite of mine. So the depiction of biblical stories also stands out to me, and narrative, how story is used in a painting. This is another Hans Memling painting, and he is known for, there was a great show at the Huntington a few years ago of all of these portraits of Christ that he did and he did several of Christ blessing with his hand, again, right on the edge of the picture frame, and this direct encounter. And the faces the portraits are about life size. So there's a direct encounter. And I snuck in a sculpture. It's, I'm going to say it's pictorial, but that it's more like a flat picture. But it's a St. John and Christ. So the idea of the beloved, and being, this is an image that has been talked about in a lot of retreats that I've been on with Michael Fish, and one that I think about a lot, that idea of resting on Christ. Okay, so back to the cell. This is one of the cells that Fra Angelico did. This is a painting of Christ's Passion. I'll come back to a little bit later too when I show some of my images, but this has always stood out. St. Dominic, I believe, is at the lower right. This depiction of Christ's Passion as being these kind of disembodied acts and around his head, and he has this kind of sense of being over the world and reigning, but also being subject to ridicule and punishment. And so, for me, a really moving image. And a very, very, this is another Jurgen Tot St. Jan's paintings. These were very graphic paintings, which can be very difficult to look at. They were made as devotional paintings too. Again, I'm assuming this was really, really tiny. This is from another painting by Fra Angelico, and at San Marco there are about, I don't know, at least 5, maybe more paintings like this of different saints from the Dominican order kneeling at the foot of the cross, and Christ's passion and blood literally pouring down on them. This figures prominently in those images. And another really unusual painting by Hans Holbein of Christ in the tomb. Even thinking about how this was painted like the size of a tomb, in a literal space of the tomb. It's a very sobering painting and very moving, I think. And this is another Christ blessing, but it's called the Man of Sorrows. So I'm assuming it becomes like the risen Christ because he is showing his hand too, but very much embedded in his passion. And the Triumphant Christ. This is the Grunwald Eisenheim altarpiece, which is part of a larger triptych and stories about the life of Christ. And the way color is used in this, the radiance of the central figure of Christ really stands out to me. And his passage from the tomb to being risen, the cloths from the tomb are still attached to him as he's rising. So he's still linked to the tomb and to the earth, but he's in another realm. So that completes the thinking about the passion, the life of Christ and his passion. And I wanted to touch on just a few more images that deal either with Mary or with other stories in the gospel, in the Bible, and then saints, depictions of saints as well. And talk a little bit about how space is used in these. In this painting by Piero della Francesca of the Madonna of Mercy has her in this really large scale. She's superhuman. And one of the things that's interesting to me in a lot of the paintings related to Christianity and in the early church are that Mary, the images of women are incredibly powerful, and you don't find that anywhere in painting, in secular painting until, maybe the 20th century, 21st century, 20th century, definitely. But that kind of dignity afforded to women is really only present in Christian iconography. And in this, the figures at the base would be people the faithful and people who might have donated money to pay for the painting. And again, the space is really, really stripped. So it's about this relationship between the Madonna and the faithful. This is a painting by Caravaggio, which is in Rome, and in the church that it's in my memory of historical buildings is not so great, but in the building, if you ever get a chance to be in Rome and look at these paintings, this painting of Paul, the conversion of Paul, is on the left side in a chapel, and this painting, the crucifixion of St. Peter, is on the right side. And so the proper way to view these when you go into that chapel is kneeling in between the two, and you see both of them on either side of you, and you can reflect on the two paintings, although you can only see them if you put money in a light box that turns on the light. So you have to either have somebody standing there to keep feeding money into the machine, or just be okay with it getting dark and being in the dark. But it's well worth the experience. So the thing that I love about these paintings, the drama of them, he had such an amazing sense of how to lead you into the scene. And they're very much of the everyday person from the time that he worked in. In fact, he got a lot of criticism because there was dirt on the Madonna's feet in one of his paintings, and he made them almost too much of the people, too kind of quotidian. And but I love that about these paintings, and the way the space is so condensed, and the drama is it's focused through the way that he uses light in the paintings. He emphasizes that so that you're led into it again by some dirty bare feet at this lower left-hand side, and then everything is designed to lead you up and over to complete the cross. There's even the shovel depicted. This again is a very tiny painting. It's by Goya, and I think it does not depict a biblical account or scene, but it's a painting he did for his doctor, who brought him to health. And Goya is depicted here, and his doctor. And then there's a prayer written prayer of thanksgiving to his doctor inscribed along the bottom of the painting. And there's something about this painting that I think about in terms of a representation both of, there's an encounter with the spiritual in this, and how we heal one another and how we take care of one another and are called to be present to one another fully. This is a painting by Vermeer, Dutch painter. And behind this woman who's using scales and weighing pearls, is a painting of Christ in heaven. But the main focus of this is this very intimate kind of scene where she's in this state of activity where she's almost meditating, and the light entering the room comes from the upper left-hand corner. And there's this sense, I think, of her being at peace, and there's something very, like, about the way these are painted that's very, a real emphasis on touch, how the paint is put down, and how carefully and the light is attended to, and the way that they're painted that stands out to me. The next three paintings are by a friend of mine, Tim Lowley, who actually, he lives in Chicago. Lowley, he took on, both he and his wife, when they got married, they took that name on. That was not his original last name, but he was really dedicated to, they were both dedicated to living a life of like austerity. And they had one child, Tema, who now is, she's in her early 30s. And when she was born, had suffered, was unconscious for a period of time, and her entire life has not been able to talk or walk or eat on her own. And she's become the subject of all of his work. And before I met him, I was in Chicago on a trip and was at, I think it was Garrett Seminary. There's a seminary in Chicago. And I had seen these drawings of this young girl, and I was really drawn to the pieces. There was something about them, this intimacy, and I had no idea of the story of Tema and what had occurred to her. And I wanted to find out who the artist was. So I eventually met Tim. And the thing that stands out to me, I put in this painting of her, this idea of hovering over her. And this next painting, you're even further above. It's her, I think that's with her mother. And it almost looks like the same location, but from a different vantage point. And then this is a painting of her in bed. And there's something about these paintings, I feel this, I keep coming back to this kind of intimacy or love and attentiveness about them that I think feels divine to me. It feels the way that they've lived their life too, and their relationship to her, which is incredibly tender and loving. And thinking about that, before I even thought about putting Tim's work in, I was thinking about this drawing by Seurat. He's known as an impressionist painter and for using a lot of color, but there were a series of drawings that he did that I think this is his mother. They're very, again, you feel this sense of kind of being known and loved that stands out to me. And this is a contemporary painter, Via Selmans, who I think there's a show up in New York right now of all of her work. And she did a whole series of spider webs, and you're going to say spider webs and the divine in one breath. But I think what I think about, she often paints like the galaxies. They're very dark and with spots of light, and I could have put one of those in. She paints the ocean, and then she brought her attention to these things that you would normally take a broom and dust aside, but that are incredibly complex shapes and forms, and that have this patterning within them that feels sacred. It's a life that's been lived under duress in a lot of circumstances, but that has this, I think, divinity to it, a presence, sacred presence. So this is a painting that I did in graduate school, and it's quite large. It's the figures are a little over life size. It's a depiction of my parents, and I was thinking a lot about a lot of the previous work that I've shown and their relationship with one another and their intimacy, but also their individuality, and that stood out to me, and wanted to depict that. And this is a painting of my mother, which I've done a number of paintings which I consider gifts. In other words, I walked in and she was doing this, and I've forgotten that she'd done it the whole time I was growing up. She had 5 children, and she was always looking for a way to get rest, and she read somewhere that if you put an ironing board at an angle like this with your feet up, it was like a slant board. It was cheap, a cheap way of doing something that she didn't want to spend extra money for. So, but when I walked in, the way the light was hitting her, she reminded me of that painting by Caravaggio of St. Peter being crucified upside down. And, but also in her role as a mother and the care she took of our home, that she would be lying on an ironing board was just, I thought it was beautiful and funny and very touching too. So I titled this In Theos, which means the God within. And the figure, she's a little larger than life size. And now I'm going to kind of toggle back and forth between a few paintings that I'm still interested in, the depiction of space, and then work that I've done, and try to move through them fairly quickly. But if you have questions, let me know too. This is again Gierkenstadt St. Jan's, and it's a depiction of the Madonna of the Rosary. And it might be hard to see, again, a very small painting, but these are angels all around her, hovering around her. And I was interested in that central image and illuminating the objects behind her. And so I ended up doing 2 paintings using that kind of form of light. And one was using a male figure with flashlights pointed at different parts of his body, and then a female figure surrounded by mirrors. And the way that I actually set this up in my studio space and then photographed it, and the way the light caught the figure and reflected throughout the space was both really beautiful. She was always aware of herself, but also of this interplay of light. And this is a painting by Botticelli, which is a secular subject matter, La Primavera. But these also have this real sense of, for me, of being human and interacting with the world. And this is a painting that I did that was kind of based on that anticipates kind of loss of someone that you love. And the flowers become, it's called flower bed, become like this encircling device around the figure. And then this is another painting I did that occurred in a very secular space in It's a Small World. But bear with me for a minute. So the figures at the bottom, the lower left-hand corner, are in one of the boats, and they were derived from this painting by Masaccio of Adam and Eve covering themselves as they left the Garden of Eden. I was thinking a lot about being in this very intense, busy environment and somehow shielding yourself or protecting yourself from it, and creating this kind of intimacy within a space like that.
Would you return to a couple frames before with the yes?
Yes.
And say a little bit more about this. This is a dead man.
It's, well, he was living in the painting, I mean, when I photographed it. But I was thinking a lot about, so this is a depiction of myself and my husband, and thinking about kind of, loving someone so intensely and thinking about their eventual death and how you might respond to them and to that state of being a passing. And so it became, I was thinking a lot when I was painting this about the whole cycle of life. So she's handing flowers, putting flowers into this circle that he's encircled by them. And they it's a little hard to read, but they enter into his mouth. They circulate around, they come out of his body too. And there's this, I was struck after I did this painting and I showed it. Somebody was telling me that their family did something very similar to this to somebody in their family that they loved as part of like a burial rite. So there was, it was a very strange painting to do. I mean, I think I was thinking about it more about the cycle of the flowers initially, and as I was painting it, I realized that it was about anticipating loss. And reverencing the body. And this is another, actually, Disney space, but in Disney World, and it is called Struggle Garden. So I was thinking a lot about the Garden of Eden and placed these two figures within this space that are wrestling with one another, and they're sisters, and they share that one is wearing one's top and one is wearing the other's bottoms, and so they kind of complete one another. They're in this very tender embrace, and in this kind of enclosed garden. And the form of their embrace, I was thinking a lot about these two paintings that are by Giotto in Padua in Italy. And they're in the same chapel, and one side of the chapel is the life of Christ, and the other is the life of Mary. And how this same embrace is represented on either side. On one side, it's Judas betraying Christ, and on the other, it's Anna and Joachim at the Golden Gate. And that whole sense of how our interactions the same kind of interaction can mean very different things. I was thinking a lot about gesture and grace. This is called A Thief in the Night, and was painted, it takes place in a studio that I lived in, my husband and I, in downtown LA for 13 years. And we did have somebody break in when we were in the space, but we saw their feet going out the window. We were asleep upstairs when it happened. But this painting came together thinking about the different kind of, there are several mentions in Scripture about not storing up treasure on earth, but storing it up in heaven, and not letting moth and rust decay, but where your treasure is, your heart will be also. And so this became a meditation on that. And on the blanket or on the carpet are all the gifts we received for our wedding, with the exception of the computer, which was not around when we got married. And this kind of sense of giving up one's earthly belongings became predominant in putting the image together. The frames on the wall behind are all empty. The dog is not doing its job at all. When I was photographing for this, our dog jumped up on that chair, and he made this kind of triangle complete. So he completed it compositionally, but I had to put him in. He's the only element like engaging the viewer, and he is. And
he's the most illuminated.
Yes, he is.
As all dogs are.
Right. Of course, yeah. So I also, I bring into my paintings too a lot of things from my personal life too. When we'd go to museums or look at things we weren't supposed to touch, we always put our hands behind our back. And so I thought about that gesture as the couple looks on their belongings, and this act of removal or separation from earthly possessions. So I put in just a few images by Hildegard von Bingen. She was an amazing woman and had visions that she illustrated. And I'll just show a few of those quickly because I want to talk just briefly about that role in art too, which often produces images that are more abstract. And this is her representation of her having a vision. It's such an odd shape, but this kind of sense of something overtaking her, the divine overtaking her, and literally entering her space and field of vision. And these are some of her her drawings. She was also she wrote amazing music. If you haven't ever heard her chants, they're really worth listening to. She knew a lot about medicine, and she was very interested in these complex relationships. There's a depiction of, I don't know whether it's God or Christ at the top, and then the figure being at the center of the universe, and but within a larger body. I think this is a vision of the kingdom of God within. I think it's within this area. So very different kinds of spaces than what I've been showing, which are more kind of based on our existence in the world and the spaces we encounter. These are definitely visions, spaces of vision. This is a shaker gift drawing, which these have been really important to me. I visited the last remaining active shaker community in Maine a couple of years ago and went to one of their worship services. And there are 2 Shakers still living. They never marry. They dedicate their life to service. And these drawings were completed over a 10-year period from 1840 to 1850, and they were mostly all by women, and they had visions at that time, and or there was a member of the community that had a vision and told them what they had experienced, and their job was to try to articulate it visually. So this is a flaming tree, and they also often included text, as if the image was not enough. It had to be supplemented by their description of the event. But I was very interested in these drawings. I went and looked at a lot of them. They're spread out throughout different Shaker communities in New England, and some of them are very intimate. There are notes of encouragement to one another. It was a period of real spiritual intensity throughout America at that time, and in particular in this Shaker community. And I was interested in how symmetry was used to picture the divine. And this comes up often in a lot of different paintings. This is a painting of Ezekiel watering the dry bones by Laura Lasworth, a contemporary painter who lives in Seattle, who often uses symmetry. This is Joseph Stella, an American painter he was known famously for painting the Brooklyn Bridge and doing several paintings of those, and they're very brown paintings, and I never liked those paintings. And then I saw these paintings a few years ago at a retrospective, and he did a lot of paintings of Mary too, with a lot of floral imagery, and they're not quite symmetrical, but they're close, and they're really amazing. This is Sharon Ellis, who's a contemporary painter who lives in the desert outside of Los Angeles. And she also has done these landscape paintings that are symmetrical, that almost feel like the veins in leaves, these very charged spaces. This is one of her paintings as well. So they speak of our experiences, but also of an otherworldly experience. This is Hilma af Klint, who was a Swedish painter and artist who has just recently been, quote unquote, rediscovered, and who they now think was the first painter to deal with abstraction. She did it before any of the other painters that we all often attribute to dealing with abstraction. Another one of her paintings.
What is her name again?
Hilma af Klint, K-L-I-N-T. And I think the show, I saw her show last year in New York, and I think it's coming to LACMA or MoCA soon. She's somebody to look out for. There's a really beautiful book. I believe this is tempera on paper, but she also did, she used oil. This looks more like tempera, though. It's kind of drier. And this is, I think, the Tree of Knowledge. So she had a very elaborate system. And she also writes about receiving visions. And she worked very intensely for very, short periods of bursts of energy in short periods of time. And this is another artist, Agnes Pelton, who there'll be a show of her work. She's also been rediscovered. She was working in the early 20th century, and there's going to be a show of her work at the Palm Springs Museum this spring. And this is one of her paintings, a passion flower. So the symbolism of the passion flower is it's interesting to read about, because every single petal, every square inch of it has been looked at in terms of its symbolism to the Passion of Christ. Which leads me into a painting I did called Passion Painting. A few years ago, well, over 20 years ago, I guess now. And it came out of thinking about that earlier painting I showed of early on by Fra Angelico of Christ with the elements of his passion around him. And I ended up putting in the rooster who's about to crow. And instead of representing all of the elements of the passion, I put a passion vine behind the sleeping girl's head. And I was interested in this moment where everything is about to change. The rooster's about to crow, the dog's looking off in the distance at something, and that whole setting is going to change. And this was something, the girl sleeping at the card table was something I saw at a flea market. So I think spiritual inspiration can come from any source, and I believe that firmly. This is an example, another Fra Angelico painting of the instruments of the Passion around Christ's head. And this is a detail of the painting. So you can see the Passion vine almost becomes like a Rorschach image behind her head. So it's that deeply ingrained, I was thinking, in her being and her mind and thoughts. This is the image that was on the bulletin cover, and it's a painting that I did after doing the larger painting. So you can kind of see how the paintings are built up. I oftentimes leave a lot of drawing remaining, and I was interested in this detail, so it's not as much of a narrative, an overall narrative, but goes straight kind of to the subject matter and leaves the passion flower and the girl's face as a primary image. This painting is called Struggle Garden, and I had been thinking a lot. I've been reading the Psalms, studying them quite a bit, and was really interested in how many times. So I've been looking at thinking about how many times the condition of sin is referred to as being stuck in the miry depths and sinking, and then conversely, I was thinking about all these films that I'd seen, B-movies as a child, where the hero met its demise in quicksand, and that was like a trope that was used and terrified me. So I told my father-in-law about wanting to do this painting. He's a gardener, and he said he would make mud in his garden for me, which was very generous. And so he posed for me, and he said he completely understood being stuck in the mud and in that condition of sin, and he was happy to pose. So as I was doing the painting, I was thinking a lot about, there was that painting by Vermeer of the light in the upper left coming in, and I was thinking about the figure being like engaged in or struck by this encounter with God, in the midst of being stuck in this kind of earthly quagmire. And all of the animals, there are a number of squirrels, here's one, and birds, there's one here and here. They're all looking in the same direction. And so that idea of all creation turning towards God was important to me. Plus, squirrels are just so amazing, the way they like will stop in their tracks and look off. This painting is called Summons, and this is another one of my paintings. They're large scale. I should indicate too, the figures are like the figures in the foreground are life size, and so you get this sense of really get this sense of a wave, although it's a very thinly painted wave coming up behind them, and that sense of the figure, like an adolescent female being given this really strong voice, even though she's standing as though she's not entirely confident. And everyone in the boat listening to her, there's something about this kind of source of strength in the midst of adversity that stands out to me. And I was thinking a lot about Christ calming the waves in the storm. So there are these kind of parallels to biblical stories, to accounts. I was able at one point to, I gave a talk at the Getty and I got to pick whatever painting I wanted to talk about, and I chose this painting by Dirk Bouts, which is an Annunciation, which I loved in part. I loved the sparsity of the image and the way that Mary holds her hands like she's receiving Christ and also kind of holding the world at the same time. And I was interested in representations of the Annunciation, and I ended up doing this painting that situates an encounter of a young girl, again about 13, in her room. And she could either be kind of play acting. It's called Overshadowed. We used to play church when I was growing up a lot. She could be doing that, or it could be an act, something happening, a divine act. There's a bird cage that's empty, and she's playing with the light that's coming from the light bulb and casting the shadow, like a hand shadow of a dove on her abdomen. And then when I came to take pictures of my niece, I told her about it, and she agreed to be photographed. And we picked up her room. This is the picked up version. So, which I know now that I have a 16-year-old daughter, that is just the way things go. But I also pulled a lot of things out on the right side. So it was important to me that there's this sense of, the world and so much happening, and then that it empties out as you move to the right-hand side of the painting. And that is something about making room for God, too, I think. And this is another painting by, I think it's by Dirk Bouts. It's of the Madonna, Sorrowful Madonna. And when I encountered this, I thought about how few images there are of people crying. And I also thought about how important it is for me when I'm looking at paintings to think about one's spiritual life is not always a situation where you feel close to God all the time. And there are a lot of points in our lives where sorrow overcomes us and where we also feel dry spiritually. And encountering that in paintings can be, I think, a way of acknowledging that and understanding that and accepting that too. And I did a series of paintings of a friend crying, which were difficult to do, I think, especially as I did it when she was looking straight at the viewer when I was painting it, I really felt like crying, and I knew I had gotten that correct, because there's something about encountering somebody who's crying where you feel that kind of instant empathy. This is another painting that I did called A Wash. So thinking a lot, kind of being, the light washes over the figure, but also being a wash in some kind of moment or encounter. It's in a camping ground in a bathroom. And then these next couple of paintings are from this show that I had this fall called All Is Leaf. And this is a painting called First Bite. Again, a lot of these come from actual events, and I have an apple tree. We have an apple tree in our backyard, and a friend's son was visiting and was running around the yard. It was a hot day, and he started taking off all his clothes, and then there were apples on the tree, and he started eating them. They apparently were not very good apples, because he would take a bite and then throw them down. But there's something about that idea. It reminded me very much of the state of humanity and the Garden of Eden. But also this sense of when you first eat something and how it tastes and how it affects your whole relationship to food and to the world. And the tree, the apple tree behind him, I ended up, again, like in that earlier painting with the young girl sleeping, cutting it in half and flipping the image so that it's symmetrical. And it has this, for me, this important presence. It becomes like the tree of life. And this was another painting in the exhibition called Circumscribe, which has the same young girl is depicted twice, moving away towards and away from the viewer, and kind of establishing this space underneath the tree, and speaking to me of like this kind of circle of one's life, and encountering oneself too. This is a drawing for it. I put in way too many images, so I will. And this last few paintings that I wanted to show are a series that I've done during the 40 days of Lent as a way, instead of giving up something, of taking something on. And the criteria was that I would make a painting every day with the time that I had that day that would somehow speak about my daily encounters with the divine and with my human interaction. So this was incense. They're all 6 by 8 inches. This is a tray of ashes. These are some mosquito hawks that ordinarily I might have swatted away, but I spent time looking at them and painting them. They seem to be like in preponderance at that time of the year. A gift from my cat. Cleaning up the house. A lot of these were really embedded in the everyday and in being a mother, I think, too. These are dust bunnies. And this is a detail of a Zurbaran painting, Agnus Dei, the lamb with its hooves bound. They were shown one iteration of them at the Cathedral of Our Lady of Angels in downtown LA in one of the side chapels, and I really appreciated the opportunity to have those in that space. It felt like that was where they were meant to be. So the paintings I'm interested in, you can see some of them, this that I just showed. This is the lamb's legs, here's the mouse. Some of them are admittedly, I think, better than others, but they form this kind of chronicle of a period of time that's important to me. And this is another year that I did them. And you can see like certain events. This was when Pope Benedict stepped down and he waved goodbye. This was when Pope Francis was elected, and the gray smoke meant that there was not a pope, and then the white was when he became pope. Detail of that painting. This was from a retreat that I went on, Father Michael Fish. This was something he projected during the retreat that was important to me. So it's a screen pointed sideways. I do have a lot more, and I'll just go through them quickly, thinking about abstract space. And this is a painting by Agnes Martin, who passed away recently. And how space, this is the Mark Rothko Chapel in Texas, in Houston. How even a veil of color like this might allow you to encounter the divine. There are times when all of kind of the noise of the world becomes kind of overwhelming, and being in front of like a veil of color, a space like that is really important. This is a James Turrell. It's actually a sculptural piece. I think it's in Pomona on campus, college campus. And at different times of the day, especially sunrise and sunset, the interior is lit up in a way that and with different colors, it affects how you read the sky and the passage of time and the passage of light. Those are 4 different light cycles, and morning and night.
This is a show that is currently up at a place called Bridge Projects in LA that I wanted to let you know about, where their focus is addressing spirituality and contemporary art. And they have an amazing program of different lectures. It's worth knowing about and going to. And this is a show that like I said, is just up. These lights constantly change, so you're bathed in light. And they're posted on these columns within the space. And then finally, this is the window that Angela referred to that I did, speaking of light, at Mayfield Junior School in Pasadena. The window at the left, I didn't design, Judson Studios did, but it was done in concert to kind of complement the main window, which includes a depiction of the foundress of the school, Cornelia Conley, and then a child from each grade level in the school, and they're involved in different activities. So one of them, like St. Luke, is drawing Cornelia. This is a tambourine and a flute. There is a child reading, playing a ukulele, kind of comforting Cornelia, reading a story with Cornelia, and bringing her flowers. And then the final one on the lower left is a girl
praying, blessing herself. And these are, so you can see what the details are like. So the book actually, it was the giving tree, and that part of the drawing is in there of the tree, but you can also see the whole world, the world beyond through that, the school and the children. And this is the young girl in the lower left. They have a squirrel problem on campus, and the squirrels continually steal lunches. So the squirrel had to be in there. That's kind of an inside joke. Okay. And I've talked for a long time, but happy to answer any questions you might have. Yeah. You're welcome.
Are there any questions before we finish?
2 questions. Where is your Annunciation painting now? And is there any publication that contains your paintings and drawings?
So the Annunciation painting is part of the Amundsen collection, which I'm really excited about. And they have, they've dedicated themselves to, they collect a lot of art, but they especially collect work that has significance in terms of its either historical or contemporary relationship to Christianity. And so they have a show up right now in Irvine at the Amundsen Gallery it's called Blessed Art Thou, and it's all work that is about the life of Mary. And I brought the catalog. You can look at it. So there is a catalog. There's one reproduction of that painting in the catalog. And there's also a really interesting essay by an art historian he is brilliant, and he reads much more into the painting than I put in. There may have been divine intervention with that, because I certainly didn't pick up on certain things he claims are there. So, and then I don't have any catalogs like of the work that are just dedicated to my work, but there is another book by Judith Dupre. What is it's?
I have two of them, but that's Mary.
Yeah, it's another book on Mary, and the painting of the young girl, the passion painting, Asleep at the Card Table, is in that book, and she writes about that. And then I have a few small catalogs from shows I've been in, but they're very small. So that's something I would love to be able to do, and to be able to self-publish, and because the amount of people who can address a lot of the issues that are present in the work, contemporary art critics, is very small. And I was lucky that Leah Ullman wrote about the show in the fall, because she touched on a lot of the issues that are present in the work, and she was very articulate about the role of spirituality in the work. But the show at the Amundsen Gallery, you have to set up an appointment before you go. They're open weekdays. I think you might be able to make a special appointment on a weekend, but I could send you that information, or you could look it up online. And it's up through, I think, June. It's up for a long time. They were hoping to get a lot of school children in, and so.
Visual representations of spirituality have, in this country largely, or in Europe and this country, have largely been the province of the Catholic tradition. Mm-hmm. Now you have places like the Brehm Center over at Fuller Seminary, where Protestants are kind of getting on the bandwagon and embracing physical art and nature. Do you find any interesting dialogues going on there where you're being informed, or they're being informed by various traditions that you weren't aware of?
Yeah, well, actually, it's interesting, because several of the recent shows I've had have all been at, like, one was at Fuller, one was at, two have been at, like, one was at APU, Azusa Pacific University, which is Protestant, and Bethel University. Most of the larger shows I've had recently have all been at Protestant, either college universities or, mainly all college universities. So there is a real interest in visual iconography and exploring. There are a lot of these schools have good art departments and art programs, and Biola too has been really active in trying to engage in conversation. The Amundsens are Protestants, and their collection comes out of that tradition. And it's really interesting when they have openings for their events. There's a lot of the monks from, what is the cloistered, the monastery near in Irvine,
Norbertines.
The Norbertines come to the openings, and they're at the dinners, and they have conversations with the artists and with, people, a lot of, contemporary secular artists too. So there are a lot of attempts to, like, renew some kind of conversation. And I often feel like there's more of an interest in it by Protestants right now than by Catholics.
I guess one of the points of follow-up would be, do you find pushback on the Marian tradition and the apostolic rendering tradition versus the Christ rendering tradition, which the Protestants have been sympathetic to forever?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I mean, I think there's a renewed interest. I think it depends on what circle you're in too, but I think there's definitely kind of a renewed interest. From what I've encountered, I don't know, I'm married to a Protestant too, and we've had an ongoing dialogue for now 34 years. And I think, yeah, I don't encounter much tension there between it. Yeah.
I feel very fortunate to see this.
Oh, thank you.
And so, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Also, it's amazing to see your work photographed here. So, is there a way that people know when your work is being shown anywhere, so you can be on a list to go see it?
Well, I'm not very good at keeping a mailing list, but I would be happy to try. If you want to leave your email address, I'd be happy to. I am going to be in 2 shows coming up, and then there's a show, 2 shows in March here in LA, but like one piece in each show, and there's the one piece at the Amundsen Gallery. And I don't have a website. I haven't done that yet. I'm on Instagram in a very minor way. With teaching and my daughter, it just.
And making art.
Yeah, there's not enough time in the day. So I've not been very good about publicizing my work. And then the gallery I just showed at, she just retired, the gallery dealer. So I'm without a gallery now. So
You need a partner in crime that does all the...
yes. Yeah. So.
Well, I would just like to thank you, Pat.
Oh, you're welcome.
on behalf of
You're
the
welcome.
Women's Connection. I truly believe that we've encountered the divine just by walking with you through your paintings.
Thank you.
We have a gift. Oftentimes on Sunday, I will see Patty in the bookstore.
Yes.
So we thought you might enjoy a little shopping spree
thank
on behalf
you.
of the Women's Connection.
Thank you.
I also want to tell you, I think our parents, well, they were of the same generation, and we went to many museums with our hands behind. But we played a game where as you walked, I'm one of 8 children. As you'd walk into a room, you would walk around, and then at the end, my father would meet us all, and each child got to say which painting they were going to take home. And so today, because every time I go through museums, I do that, and I look at Patty's paintings going, which one would I take home? And honestly, I don't know where I'd begin to choose, because they're so moving to me, and when you see them in their full form. I also thought it was ironic that the South Pasadena City Beautification Program would be doing tree trimming
Yes.
in the midst of her discussion of the Tree of Knowledge and Cornelia Conley and Eden and here. But anyway, there was so much symbolism and so much love that you shared with us. So thank you for
You're
an
welcome.
extraordinary morning. We wanted it to be taped because we want others to see this, and we're going to find you a partner for that book.
Okay.
I think it'd be a great meditation. The other idea that we had at some point is to do you know how there are all these sip and paint parties, but to do a Lenten reflection perhaps, and we'll have to talk to you about that, but where we could pray and paint, and maybe
Nice.
try your Lenten discipline. But anyway, thank you, Pat.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, my pleasure.